back in 2000, we had to modernize the system. And that's where the Global Food Safety Initiative came in. This is where the Tractor FISMA came in. And also in Canada, the Safe Food for Canadians Act. And we're kind of looking at our American cousins just to make sure that we were in line because of the amount of trade we do with the US. And the point is that this Modernization Act was meant to make things clearer. But really, what it really was starting to do is having this transition from a philosophy that industry are responsible for food safety. They're the ones that are responsible for pathogens not reaching consumers.
Welcome to the Feed Science Podcast. My name is Adam Farrenholz, coming to you from North Carolina State University's Animal Food Manufacturing Program. Thanks for joining us. On behalf of Wysenetics, I'm excited to introduce our guest. It's a return guest that we've had on the podcast before. Today we have Dr. Keith Warriner. He is a professor in the Department of Food Science at the University of Guelph. Keith, thanks for joining us again.
Oh, no, thanks for having me again.
You bet. So the last time we had a discussion, we talked about things related to food safety, and we know that that discussion was something that was from a number of our guests they found interesting, and honestly, a lot of the topics that we've done with various guests that have been to do with food safety and food safety plans and how to deal with biosecurity and all those kinds of things have become episodes that we've seen get a fair amount of interest. I don't think that's probably a huge surprise, given that that's become a major part of everybody's regulatory burden, so to speak, things that they're spending a lot of time thinking about and trying to make sure they're doing correctly. And so I think we see a lot of interest in that. And so we're going to continue to kind of expound on that. Before we do, if you wouldn't mind just reminding the listeners and the viewers of what your background is and what it is you focus on there at the University of Guelph.
Oh, for sure. So, like you say, I'm in the Department of Food Science at the University of Guelph, and my sort of research area is actually food safety. And we focus more on fresh produce, making innovations, interventions. We're also interested in food safety management systems as well. But mainly our research is to do with ensuring food safety, enhancing it, and identifying risks. And certainly recently we've got into the feed mill kind of sector in terms of pet food and other low moisture foods and things of that nature. So it's fairly broad for sure, and increasingly expanding.
Absolutely, and I think that's one of the things we've seen a lot in our industry on the animal food side is everything from the regulations that have come up that require us to do more with food safety, and some of those are new things that we now have to do, and a lot of those things are also things that we found that we've been doing anyway. We just maybe didn't know we were doing them exactly, or we weren't documenting them, that sort of thing. And then, of course, we've also had a lot of stuff that's come over from the human food side, and it's, kind of seems to matriculate human food to pet food into animal feed in a lot of ways. And we've seen practices and procedures and systems, and we've seen people. That's been another interesting one. We've seen a lot of people that, they're now in quality roles in feed companies and animal food companies that were previously with human food. And we've brought them in because they've got that area of expertise that has, at least up till now, has been more rare in our area. So I think one of the first things to start with is let's talk about what are the different examples of those food safety management systems that we actually see utilized in the industry.
It's quite interesting how history goes, isn't it? In that feed mills were definitely not viewed as human food, but more recently they've been transitioning to. And it's interesting to see the parallels in a lot of ways. If we just go through briefly a food safety management systems history, we can really go right back to 1920s, where they were talking about we need standards between countries to ensure that we're doing fair trade, like your standards are the same as our standards. Obviously, in the 1920s, they weren't quite as cooperative as they are these days, even though these days you could argue if they are cooperative. Essentially, after World War II, the FAO and the United Nations, well, the United Nations was established, the FAO, World Health Organization, World Trade Organization, and they were tasked to develop food safety standards and food standards in general. And that's where the Codex came in. So Codex is this sort of foundation for all food safety management systems. So as time went on, we obviously had good management practices, GMP, good manufacturing practices, I think good agricultural practice. But in the 80s, we're getting pretty disastrous food safety outbreaks, and it was out of control, essentially, the food industry. And that's where essentially HACCP came in, the hazard analysis critical control points. Now, HACCP was a revolution at the time in the 90s, as you could imagine. And the thing is, it got really pushback. One, because like these days, food industry say, we don't really need it. It's going to cost us more. We don't really understand it. But it did actually become established, and it was going along, but it wasn't having the impact on food safety as we expected. We got an initial drop, sanitation definitely enhanced, but the levels of foodborne illness seemed to stay totally plateaued and even not go up in certain cases. So back in 2000, we had to modernize the system, and that's where the Global Food Safety Initiative came in. This is where the Tractor FSMA came in, and also in Canada, the Safe Food for Canadians Act. And we're kind of looking at our American cousins just to make sure that we were in line because of the amount of trade we do with the US. And the point is that this Modernization Act was meant to make things clearer. But really what it really was starting to do is having this transition from a philosophy that industry are responsible for food safety. They're the ones that are responsible for pathogens not reaching consumers. And the reality was, though, is that to ensure this, the government started piling on regulations. And we get to the point where we have so many regulations, you actually have to employ somebody to understand these regulations. Whereas the government still say, no, it's the industry that's responsible, not us. And we get to this situation we're in today, whereas in the feed mill, as you rightly said, they've had these regulations, I'll say imposed on them if you want to call it imposed. But the reality is a lot of people struggle with saying, well, what are these regulations? How do we implement them? And how do we make sure they're going good and they're doing the correct thing? And in the North America especially, we've got so many regulations now, is that we've come to a point where people don't really understand what they are, how they're implemented, how to inspect them, and all these kind of things. So in a brief history of food safety management systems, it definitely has got more complex, which, and even in Europe, which usually is very hands-off, they've got more complex. And we're going to a situation now where we're literally saying, are we over-regulated? And the reason why we're talking about food mills or feed mills being kind of separate from the human food side, one could argue that the feed mills got it right. They were kind of owning their own food safety. They were doing, like you mentioned, they were doing these things that we're doing now. But when you start imposing regulations, it starts actually reducing the confidence. And a lot of feed mill owners probably saying, well, am I doing the right thing? I'm questioning myself if I'm doing the right thing. So that's where we are today in terms of food safety management. And that some people say over-regulated, not really inspected, not really audited correctly. And this is what we have to address in the future.
Yep, that all tracks with what I think we've seen the industry grow through. When you think about these the different facilities, different business units, and that sort of thing, and in your experience as they start to develop their food safety management system, whatever that might be, what are the things you usually see them go through? Like, how are they developing these systems? Are they trying to build things from scratch? Are they borrowing from others? What's kind of the typical process you see industries go through as they try to develop these systems, as the regulations and the models that they can pull from evolve?
And that's a very good point. So basically, if you go from a situation where you're basically using GM, good manufacturing practice, and then somebody comes to you and say, well, you've got a whole these raft of new regulations, hazard analysis, validations, verifications, monitoring. You come into a new area and literally your confidence in being able to say, how do you do this? It all seems forms, it all seems regulation written. And a lot of them take advantage of the Global Food Safety Initiative. So GFSI, as many of listeners will know, is to do with standardization of implementing things like HACCP. So GFSI itself is basically benchmarking. They tell you what elements you should think about. And then you got these companies that spring up. There's 13 big companies. There's other ones as well. But BRC, for example, and I know in the feed mill industry, you've got different ones, SGS and people like that. So what companies would have to do is literally go to these consultancies and say, could you build me a food safety plan, food side. And that's a very expensive undertaking. I can assure you of that. You're $1 million. And the point is that they'll implement a plan and they'll audit it as well. And some people say, well, it's a conflict of interest. How can a same company build up a plan and then basically look at itself to say if it's good? And yeah, sure enough, audits and conflict of interest do come apart. But the point is that it's this sort of giving somebody else the driving seat in a car. It's almost, I like the analogy that when we started implementing these sort of food safety management systems, it's almost you're driving your own car, you're happy with it, but then you get a driving instructor says, right, you've got to pass your test again. And suddenly you forget how to drive. So you say, well, could somebody else drive for me? And I think this is where it's coming from. So what companies tend to do, one, they certainly can go to consultants and pay all that money out and have that reassurance that someone else is driving. And in the government role, what they did is they started giving generic plans. So we'll say, we'll give you an example of a food safety management system, HACCP, or let's say food safety plan. And you base your operation on that. But what was happening is that people were taking that example and say, yeah, just fill in the boxes and it will say it's our plan. So it was a disaster. So this is why we got this transition. But it is a very big challenge. And I've talked to a few, even in the food mill industry. Obviously, I look at the human food side, but they all share the same characteristics, not really sure what they're doing. And it almost becomes dependent on what that inspector, either the government or the auditor, tells them. They're telling them a business that they've lived all their lives in almost. So this is where it starts getting a bit challenging.
Okay, that all makes a lot of sense. My guest again today is Dr. Keith Warriner from the University of Guelph in the Department of Food Science. So I think that leads in then to the question of we've evolved on our various different regulations, and people have had to develop these systems. And as you just talked about, where they might have to go through the process of creating or going and asking for help creating. That certainly is going to lead to, in some cases, facilities and companies that have a really, really good understanding of their own food safety system. And in other cases, we know that there might not be as good of an understanding of their own food safety system, if depending on how much help and the areas of expertise of the people that are inside that system and are supposed to implement it. So why do you see, or what do you see are the challenges when a food safety plan or a food safety system isn't implemented properly? Like, what comes, because we know we'll have failures of a food safety system from time to time. What are the general reasons why they fail?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And, I think if we knew the answer to that, we could solve the problem. But I always look back to an outbreak of listeria to do with almond milk, which happened in Canada last summer. Not feed mill, but I think the example is good. So just to give you perspective, if you don't remember that outbreak, there was a company, I won't say which company names, but there was a company here that produced almond milk for another company. I can say their name, Danone, really massive Italian-based dairy company. So essentially, they were producing almond milk, and they were basically a packer and things like that. So they were basically heat treating this almond milk, carton packaging, and very high heat treatment. So you thought, well, nothing go wrong here, isn't it? But something did go wrong. Basically, we had a listeria outbreak, which caused 3 deaths and 20 recorded illnesses. Obviously, the illnesses probably more than that. And I think I only bring this up because it just illustrates about the challenges of implementing food safety systems and monitoring them. So the point is that this company then had been operating for about 2 or 3 years, producing this almond milk. And they got an inspection from the CFAA a few years ago. And a bit like the US, what the CFAA have transitioned to is this sort of smart inspection service, based on risk. So they've got this famous algorithm which they developed, which basically said that if we have this sort of product, well, it's heat treated, hasn't really been the cause of illnesses before, so it should be safe. And then you've got another column which is basically saying, well, have they got implemented a food safety system? Do they have interventions like heat processing? And do they have third-party audits in the next column? And the third column is to do with their inspection. Well, the point being is that you get to a point where they looked at the algorithm and it said this facility producing almond milk was low risk. Don't worry about it. Now, the problem is that as time went by, we were starting to get complaints from consumers saying this milk's moldy. There's something happening. Now, the point was in the algorithm of the CFAA, it was the fact that if it's not a food safety issue, it wouldn't be put into the algorithm to push that inspection requirement of the order. So the CFAA didn't inspect it for years, and they were depending on these third-party auditors to come in. Because obviously Danone wanted to make sure that they were producing it safe and all this. Anyway, to the point. So the point is that they were depending on the auditors to say something, and the audit reports would ordinarily go into this algorithm. So if the auditor found issues, it would have pushed up the order of inspection. But for whatever reason, we still don't know. That never happened. So the point was, when this outbreak broke last year, those illnesses could be traced back for over a year, maybe even longer. And this was the failure of the food safety system. The company essentially was saying, no one's telling us we're doing wrong. Now, the CFAA obviously weren't even in there, so they couldn't tell them we're doing wrong. And the auditor, we don't know what they were doing, but obviously they seemed happy with life to do that. So it's almost like they were looking at each other saying, the CFA were looking at the auditors saying, well, they would tell us if something's wrong, wouldn't they? And the company looking at the auditors saying, well, they're saying we're not doing anything wrong. And so nobody was driving the car at all. It was just going blindly. So to answer your question saying, what is going wrong with the food safety system? We literally haven't got drivers in a lot of cases. Obviously, not everyone's the same. I think you do get the good players and the bad players. And those bad players, that's why regulations are drawn. I can't talk about the melamine case if you want. It was one very devastating for definite, but they started to put in place regulations and everything like that based on that. But coming back to the point in that, when you have an effective food safety system and somebody comes in saying, well, look at these regulations, you've got to do this, that, and the other, you start losing control of our food safety system in terms of someone else is driving the car now. Mm-hmm. And I think that's where we are at the moment, is that there are good players, a lot of good players, even good auditors. The reality is they are. But I think we're looking at each other saying, well, who's driving the car today? And that's where the problems lie.
It's time for our famous 3. Evonik Animal Nutrition is committed to ensure food security and safety while reducing the ecological footprint of animal farming. Its products and services use evidence-based solutions that seek to promote animal welfare and reduce reliance on natural resources. All this is underpinned by long-standing industry partnerships and deep customer understanding. Evonik's focus on efficiency, sustainable, healthy nutrition, and collaborations with livestock farming partners creates value for customers and consumers.
I think it's interesting too from that perspective of where things might go wrong, and the best safety systems, and this is food safety, this is personnel safety, this is, all kinds of stuff. The best safety systems are the ones that are like trying really hard to find the things that are wrong. But when and we all understand this, because we do it, in our personal life as well. This is the same kind of thing that would go into like financial auditing. The best systems are the ones that are going to try really hard to uncover problems. But when we're the ones that will potentially be impacted when a problem is found, and we're the ones that are developing the plans, it gets difficult to say that I want to develop a plan that is more likely to find something wrong with my system, right? Because I know if I find something wrong with my system, I'm going to have to potentially deal with anything from a financial issue, a regulatory issue, all these kinds of things, and trying to deal with that on the risk assessment basis and the legal basis all becomes really difficult. And I think one of the things you started talking about that I'd like to ask you some more about is where then we have a lot of different ways we can audit our facilities. We can self-audit. We can have customers that can audit. We can obviously have third-party systems that audit, and we can certainly have regulatory audits and inspections. So what are the various, pros and cons and the weaknesses or in some cases strengths of those different types of audits and how they should be performed, or when they're performed poorly and they give us a false sense of security, how dangerous that can be, which is in that example you just shared there.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think as we talked about, there's good players and there's bad players. And what I increasingly see is the good players literally start questioning themselves, saying, we should be doing more. And a few companies contact me, especially in terms of the risk analysis part, you're looking at hazards. And if they can't find a hazard, they get upset and they want hazards to put in the book. Whereas you get the other side where you basically, yes, they say we can never attain this, but we'll just do what we can do. So the point is that with auditing, with the GFSI, for example, the point, even though they won't admit it, is that it was privatization of the food inspection service. And they had this conflict of interest saying, I'm going to develop this plan. Yeah, you just give me $1 million. I can develop your food safety plan. And we'll send in auditors. And we got this sort of situation of, you've got to give us warning about audits for a start. So, audit day, everybody get ready and things like that. Brush everything up. So it's not really, it's a very false sense of looking at how the plants run. And the point is that with these auditors, if you didn't like what the audit report said, you just get a new auditor. And this is what happened in Boar's Head. They literally 2 years ago with the Listeria Boar Head is the deli meat. They got a bad audit and said, right, so get rid of them and we'll get somebody else in, which they did. So you got this, what we call grade inflation. So essentially auditors wanted to say, yes, we're doing well and things like that. And the point is these auditors were kind of giving very high level marks, if you want to call it grades or marks, if you want to call it. And they say, oh, look, the producer's doing well, aren't we? But I don't need to remind you of the Peanut Corporation of America, for example, and the Excel Foods Institute, which was this sort of beef plant in Alberta, and also the Jensen brothers. They all received 95% five-star audits a month before these outbreaks occurred, Listeria cancer and things like that. And it's got to the point now where if you don't get 100% almost, or 99%, you feel you've failed. And I think this is a problem. The company's got a fear of failure. And if you do this, like even in our business, in the academic business, if you keep giving students 100%, they say, why do we need to improve? And I think that's where we're at, in that we're looking at each other saying, well, they never said it was wrong, so we must be doing something right. And it's got to the point where retailers now are even questioning auditors' reports. And that's quite astonishing, given that they're the ones that actually established GFSI, but that's life, isn't it? So in a lot of ways, I think you might even have to go right back, not so much to the beginning, but give people the confidence to implement their own food safety and systems. And it's almost a point where, and a lot of the major sort of companies do this, they're training the inspectors, be it government or auditors. So when you take them through the plant, you're telling them what to look for, rather than this sort of get ready for audit day. We're going to be so smooth on this day that nothing can go wrong, and things like this. So give it the power to the processes, I guess, is the ultimate answer, so they can train the next generation.
I think a couple things there. I love your example of sitting in a university as well, and that idea of, well, we can do the grade inflation, and we can the students can be happy, and they're paying a lot of money to come to school, and they can be happy with their high grade, their high GPA, and then they go out and they get asked a question after they graduate that they should be able to answer, or a problem that they should be able to solve, and they can't. Then we've failed the system and we failed them. And the same thing, I think, as you pointed out, is true there, where if we're so afraid of, for whatever reason, just afraid of failure, or that customers won't buy from us anymore, something like that, and then so you end up making the system weaker so that everybody can succeed inside the system. Well, that's fine right up until there's a problem. And then there's a food safety problem, and you're completely unprepared for it because there wasn't a standard before. Of course, that then comes back to working with the regulatory agencies to say, well, we'd love to hold people to a higher standard, but you're going to have to take some teeth out of what you would do if you find a problem too, because then nobody wants to be held to that higher standard if they know they're going to have, really incredibly serious consequences to their business. So if there's more of a ability to work together on creating a better system, that always seems to be best. So with that in mind, as we hit the end of our time here, if, from your perspective, what are the, top one or two, maybe three things that could really be done to improve these food safety plans, these food safety systems overall, where we'd have, safe and safer food for humans, for animals, but also a more effective system to actually operate in?
Yeah, so in my mind, and it's very difficult, it's impossible almost to go back and rewrite FSMA. The reality is FSMA, the actual philosophy of FSMA is quite good. It makes total logical sense based on codex. But the reality is they've got to make the language simpler. They don't make it into a sort of mystery box that you have to understand the riddles. So make it understandable. Certainly say to totally directly to industry, saying, FDA, CFAA, we're not here to teach you. We're not here to educate you. We're here to enforce rules. You're totally responsible as an industry to look after yourselves. And that's the point. And also increase the training of it. Let's get away from the philosophy that auditors and inspectors are these sort of people who come around and want to close you down. Mm-hmm. Educate them, because if you educate a good company, educates them, they go to the bad players, which, basically a lot of regulations are played on. They're not represented. They'll be able to inspect better. So it's literally is a case of working together rather than saying, well, who's going to drive the car? Make sure we know who's driving. But your analogy on the university front is absolutely very true. You're just holding problems for the future if you don't do it right.
And I love that idea there of what you just said. And I think most of our good players, and especially when they're good and they're larger, do tend or certainly are willing to do exactly what you said and say, look, we're going to hold ourselves to these high standards. We want everybody else in our industry to be held to these standards as well. We think it's ethically correct. It also makes sense from us from a market competitiveness type of a situation. We don't want to be competing with somebody that's doing a worse job. That's not fair and balanced. So them stepping up to say, hey, how can we help inspect, or how can we help auditors and inspectors get better at their jobs, instead of, nope, we're not going to tell you any of our secrets. We're not going to bring you into you would know too much. And it's no, there's probably is no too much. We want the people who are trying to make sure this is being done right to know enough that they can go out and not be surprised by things that they see and then help find solutions for them. I think that's like you said, I think that's the way forward.
Absolutely. Yeah. Not be blind to things and not be frightened of making tough decisions. They say food safety is not competitive, but the reality is there is a competitive edge there. But as I say, if one sector suffers, all the sector suffers. And even though it's an easy thing to say, implementation-wise, I think some people still need to understand it.
I agree. Well, my guest today has been Dr. Keith Warriner from the University of Guelph. He's a professor in the Department of Food Science there. Keith, it was really good talking to you again. I appreciate all your insight.
Oh, no, thanks for the invitation.
Once again, this has been the Feed Science Podcast. I'm Adam Farrells, coming to you from North Carolina State University. On behalf of Wise Genetics, thanks for listening, and we will talk to you the next time.